Appreciate you joining us again in this study of the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to be turning to chapter 7, and we will continue our discussion of that chapter. Let's again remember what's going on. Studying this in just 30-minute sections is really difficult to keep a flow going of what we see. And with Isaiah, there's a flood of emotions almost. Those first 5 chapters were dark and gloomy. And then chapter 6, you see his call to prophecy, and you see such a powerful lesson where he saw God, he saw himself, and he saw his mission. And then here in chapter 7, we talked about the historical setting of that Syro-Ephraimitic war. Tiglath-Pileser had gained the throne, Tiglath-Pileser III. Israel and Syria had formed an alliance against him. They wanted Ahaz to join that alliance, and he refused to do so, or at that point he refused to do so. And then later he's going to be bound to go to Assyria for help. And in the context of this, we see this reference to a sign that is going to occur. Now, the entirety of chapter 7 is important, but we're going to zero in there on verse 14 and 15 as we relate to the big issue. Now, let me just plug in something here. One of the reasons that this is such a big issue is because of the Revised Standard Version, the RSV. And when it came out, it chose to interpret the word virgin that's used in this passage as young woman, young maiden. And it set off a firestorm. I had to read a book when I was working on my doctor's degree as it related to the RSV controversy. And when that happened, it created a mess because of the conclusions that people came to and the way the skeptics attacked whether or not this was indeed a divine birth that was seen. So I've planted that seed. We'll touch on it as we move here through the text. And then my plan, as I said last time, is to go all the way through chapter 7, giving just cursory attention to the verses under question. And then I've got an appendix at the end of my notes on this chapter that I've come back to do a little bit more detail there and for us to understand that. And I hope that you'll benefit from that. I hope that we'll grow in our understanding of the book of Isaiah as we look at these things. Now, we're going to see throughout the book, we're going to see hard times, harsh times, and then there's going to be very upbeat times, and a lot of hope is portrayed, especially regarding the remnant. There's not a lot of hope portrayed as it relates to the two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. For Israel, it's already too late. It's just going to be a matter of years now, a few years, until they're going to come to an end as a nation, going to lose that national distinction. And then it's going to be a little over around 100 years before that begins happening to Judah. Judah is not going to heed the words of Isaiah, just as they had ignored other prophets that were sent to them. But even through all of that harsh language, even through all of the woes against the nations, as a matter of fact, the next section we're going to look at, remember this section, chapter 7, starts a 5-chapter section known as the Book of Emmanuel. And so we're going to see chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 11 are going to be 3 key prophecies of the Messiah. Well, then in chapter 13, verse 23 through chapter 23, we're going to see dark times again because all the nations around Judah are going to be judged by God. And God is going to use other nations to bring about his will, just as he did so with Israel. Assyria was used to punish Israel. Babylon is going to be used to punish Judah. They're going to go down. And other nations are going to be used to do that. But even through that, I've started chapter 13. We're through chapter 16 up at Brown Trail now this quarter. And we're already seeing in that context that even though it's dark, even though it's dreary, even though it's depressing, you still see something about the remnant. God wanted to keep people hopeful as it relates to the overall plan, which is why there's so much stated about the Messiah in this book. 110 prophecies, many of them messianic, because that is the hope of everybody. Is for that seed of woman, Genesis 3:15, the seed of Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, the seed of Judah, as we see that move right on down, and then the remnant is going to be the tool that God is going to use to continue to work and to bring Christ onto the scene when the time is right. So let's look at verses 10 through 17 and look at this sign of the Lord. Chapter 7, verses 10 through 17. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, Hear now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. The Lord will bring the king of Assyria upon you, and your people and your father's house, days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah. Well, we need to understand something about what Ahaz should know at this point. He is a king in the line of David. These Jews would understand what Genesis 49:10 said about the scepter not departing from Judah until the one to whom it belongs comes. They would have been privy to the promise made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that God was going to keep that line pure. Ahaz was in that line, and there were going to be more after him. And so this should have made him sit up and take notice regarding the things that were going to occur through that line. But Ahaz did what so many people are guilty of doing. We leave God out of our thought and try to find a human solution to things, rather than have the faith that we should have and operate on that faith. Just a couple of examples. I was talking to some of the students about this just this week. Abraham and Sarah. They were told, Abraham, through your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Both thought themselves too old. Sarah, as time went on, still found herself barren. And so she sought out Hagar, gave Hagar to Abraham as a wife. Though that was culturally acceptable, it wasn't what God had in mind. It was through his seed. Isaac was the one that God had in mind. But Sarah turned to a human solution to that. How about the 12 spies? They had been told that the land was going to be theirs. God had promised them that. He had told them it was a land flowing with milk and honey. And they came back and they said, yes, the land is everything that God said it would be, but we can't go in. We can't take it because there's giants there. Rather than looking to the faith that they should have had and had been given ample evidence for, God had taken down numerous enemies. God had miraculously provided for them. And in this promise, they should have looked up and looked to God. Instead, they looked at those giants and they looked at their own human limitations and said, we can't do this. Ahaz is going to do the same thing. Ahaz should have looked to God, and there Isaiah asked him, ask God for a sign. Well, what sign did Ahaz need to understand at this point? Ahaz needed to know that the line was not going to cease. Because you see, the kings of Israel and Syria, their intent before and really causing Ahaz to seek out Tiglath-Pileser and just to choose to put himself in tribute to Assyria. They were going to come take him out, and they were going to put a puppet king on the throne. That would have broken the Davidic line. Ahaz should have known. The religious leaders of that day should have known that God had already promised that that line was not going to be broken. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. Even in the time of David, remember, it had been said, I'm going to protect that line. We're going to keep it pure. Well, I see a little bit of humor here, and I see a little bit of sarcasm as it relates to Ahaz. Isaiah told him, ask God for a sign. Now that word sign there in the original language means miracle or pledge. And it's used 11 times in the book of Isaiah itself. Isaiah told him, in essence, ask for a sign. Ask God to show you about the promise, because there's no challenge that is too great for God. Well, Ahaz refused, and he said, I'm not going to test God. Well, let's realize Ahaz has already made up his mind. Ahaz knows that he's going to bow down to Assyria. He already has that decision made in his mind, because you see, that's the most plausible solution to him from a purely human perspective. I'll go ahead and just submit myself to the authority of Assyria. I'll pay them tribute, and they'll come take care of me. And initially they did. Initially they came against Israel and Syria. But later on, they're going to come back. In the time of Hezekiah, later on, Sennacherib, the ruler at that time, is going to try to come down and wipe them out. And unless God had intervened, there you find 185,000 of his troops dying. We see God in a divine way sending a messenger to deliver them. Sennacherib was so convinced that he was going to be able to take it, that on his prism, it's called Sennacherib's prism. It's a clay cylinder. I believe it's in the London Library, if I'm not mistaken. But there was a quote on that cylinder that said, I had him shut up as a bird in a cage. It was all over but the shouting for Sennacherib. And then he was sent home, defeated. More evidence that God is more than capable of following through with the promises that he made. You see, Hezekiah was of that same line, that same dynasty, one single dynasty through the kings of Judah, through which Messiah was going to come. Christ, yes, was going to sit on the throne of David. So Isaiah used a little sarcasm as well. Well, you test men, why don't you test God too? In essence, that's what the question means that he asked. The phrase, the house of David, there in verse 13, should recall to us God's promise to David. We've already discussed that. His descendants would reign over Jerusalem. Verse 14, Ahaz refused, but he was given a sign anyway. Now, part of the problem is people try to make this a dual fulfillment prophecy, that it referred to a child in Ahaz's day and it refers to a child in Christ's day. I challenge that view because of the nature of the birth. I do believe that's why the RSV may have gone the route that they went, trying to understand how this was a sign in his day. I believe it was a sign in his day because the line of David was going to be kept pure. That was for him to know at that point he could focus on God. He could give his attention to God. He could operate in faith toward God and not worry about Assyria, Israel, Syria, or all these other armies around them, because God had promised that he would care for them. and he was given a sign, God's will is going to come to completion. And we know that it was messianic when we get ahead to Matthew chapter 1 and see this passage quoted and applied to Christ. Now, here's something else that I told my students this week, and I want us to kind of understand how it would help us in our Bible study. I want us to imagine the Bible. Let's imagine this section of verses as a painting. Our problem is when we try to put our nose against that painting and focus on the brush strokes. And what we need to do is step away from it and look at the picture as a whole. It's easy to get bogged down in details. The details aren't important here. This is future tense. And the Bible is its own best commentary. So let's let Matthew tell us what this passage means through inspiration as he applies this to Christ. The name Emmanuel means God with us. That should help us as we seek to understand those thoughts. Well, going down to verse 17, Ahaz would indeed seek security from Assyria, but that would not give him the stability. It wouldn't give him the security, the stabilization that he's looking for. Assyria is a bunch of pagans. You're going to look at kings that are going to operate on their best interest. And if they choose to make a covenant, they can be just as free to break that covenant because they're in power, they're in control. They call the shots, they pull the strings. Maybe Ahaz was somewhat naive in thinking that Assyria would keep on helping him, when in reality, hindsight is 20/20. And we don't see the reference, but I'm relatively sure that Ahaz regretted what he did. If Ahaz looked back, and he would have seen that he made a bad decision at that point, but it was a bad decision because it was made on a lack of faith. And it was a purely human response to what his problems were at that time. Now, the national savior, talking here about Assyria, that's what Ahaz saw, was a national savior. He may have even seen these alliances that we're talking about. When we get to chapters 13 through 23, as I said early on, we're going to see all these nations around them falling. I believe one of the purposes that we have in those chapters 13 through 23 and the burden against all of these countries is to show Ahaz the folly of putting his confidence in them, because they're going to go down. Even Assyria is going to go down. 13 years after the Syro-Ephraimitic War that we talked about in introducing this section, 13 years after that, Israel fell in 722 BC. Note the alliance with Syria didn't help them at all. Israel suffered from the same problem that Judah suffered with. They left God. They looked to their idols. They looked to their own solution to things. They were corrupt in the inner workings of the kingdom. And then they sought these alliances to help. And again, prophet after prophet after prophet had been sent to them as well to call them back to God and realize that was the solution to all their problems. So instead of trusting in God, bottom line, tying this section together, and then we'll move on to the last section of chapter 7. Ahaz attempted to do things by his own power. You know, I try to always look for good application points. And those of us who have kids, remember when they were born? And remember, we love taking care of them, but eventually we get to thinking, boy, I'll be ready. I'll be glad when they can go to the bathroom by themselves. I'll be glad when they can tie their shoes by themselves. I'll be glad when they can get dressed by themselves. And I can remember the first time that my children said, I can do it by myself. That's an independence. And it's okay as it relates to some of these things that we should be able to do by ourselves. But it's an ungodly, unfaithful attitude whenever God offers to help and we say, no, thank you, I can do it by myself. I'll choose my own resolution to the problem that's going on. That's exactly what Ahaz did in this context. Now, verse 18 through the end of the chapter, we're looking at the plot against King Ahaz, and still that war comes back to play. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the farthest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They will come, and all of them will rest in the desolate valleys and in the clefts of the rocks, and on all the thorns and in all the pastures. In the same day the Lord will shave with a hired razor with those from beyond the river, with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the legs, and will also remove the beard. It shall be in that day that a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. So it shall be from the abundance of milk they give that he will eat curds. For curds and honey everyone will eat who is left in the land. It shall happen in that day that wherever there could be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver, it will be for briars and thorns. With arrows and bows of men will come there, because all the land will become briars and thorns. And to any hill which could be dug with the hoe, they will not go there for fear of briars and thorns, but it will become a range for oxen and a place for sheep to roam. Okay, having made the promise about this child who is going to be born of a virgin, keep that thought in mind when we get over to Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. For unto us a child is born. And we see the concept of the king being referenced there again. In Isaiah chapter 11, we're going to talk about that branch from the root of Jesse. So those are pointing toward Messiah. But now we're coming back down to Ahaz, his time, how he's going to be affected. What's going to happen to him because of his failure to do what Isaiah bid him to do. Well, again, this is a reference to this Syro-Ephraimitic war. They're going to find themselves in all kinds of trouble because their refusal, Ahaz's refusal to join the alliance of Israel and Syria, are going to bring them against them. And then Philistines are going to come. Edomites are going to come. They're going to be coming from Egypt. They're going to be coming from every which way. The heat on the pot's going to get turned up on them here. Now, when Ahaz was told what was about to happen, his heart and the hearts of the people shook. For you see, their fears were justified because of the defeats that they had already suffered at the hands of some of these. And to be told that it's going to get worse is not good. Now, verse I got ahead of myself here. Excuse me. I got backwards on my notes. Let me go back here again. Thank you. So Isaiah refers to Judah's so-called allies. Egypt could never be counted on for help, yet they tried to do so regularly. When we move into the Maccabean period, when you're looking at 2 nations that were basically the descendants of 2 of Alexander's generals who took the kingdom after Alexander died without an heir, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. You've got the Seleucids in Syria, you got the Ptolemies in Egypt. And these people are going to be a buffer state again. They're going to bounce back and forth as to who they try to get to help them. The hired razor that Isaiah spoke of here had to do with alliances with other nations. And they're going to pay a heavy price for those alliances. The figure of shaving the beard with a hired razor, what that means is God is going to use another country to come in and punish and humiliate his people. That sense of shaving the hair off the face, shaving the hair off the legs, was that which was a picture given of shame. They're going to be defeated and they're going to be humbled by these armies out there. He even refers to them as pesky bugs. Flies and bees are what's going to be used. Verses 21 to 22. For this, I want us to go back to chapter 5. Remember there the parable of the vineyard, or the song of the vineyard. Remember, it was indicated that the vine dresser had done everything possible to bring about a good, bountiful, sweet grape harvest. Yet when the grapes came in, they were sour. They were not good. They were not what was expected. The vine dresser could have done nothing more to prepare better for that harvest. And as many parables we see the application made, that referred to Judah. God had done everything possible. He had given his will. He had provided leadership. He sent prophets to remind the people. And yet the harvest wasn't what it was supposed to be. And so therefore, it was going to be made a wasteland. Briars and thorns were all you were going to see. Note that same language used here at the end of chapter 7 as it relates to Judah. Now, let's go ahead and deal just a few minutes. I've got about 4 minutes left. Let's deal with Isaiah 7:14. And rather than seeing the dual fulfillment here, I'd love to spend more time with this section, but we've got a long way to go. We have 66 chapters. I'm not on any kind of time frame that I know of per se, but I don't want to get so bogged down, as I said, with the individual brushstrokes. But this is important, because there are many out there who say that the birth spoken of here was not a virgin birth. It was a young maiden who was going to have this child. The word that we see there in verse 14 is behold, and it's a word that calls our attention. It's waking us up. Look here. That's what he's saying. Now, a great deal has been written about the identity of the virgin and the son that's born to her. So let's go ahead and deal from a source outside of our Bibles. I want to focus on the Septuagint translation. 250 BC, the Greek translation, the Hebrew Bible was converted into Greek to be placed in the library at Alexandria. And this was a translation that was available in the first century. Isaiah, written in Hebrew, you could go to the Septuagint, LXX is how it's abbreviated, and you could see it in the Greek, the language, more of the language. Because see, Alexander, by 250 BC, had already Hellenized a great bit of the world. The word used in the Hebrew is the word Alma, and it is a word that context has to determine it. It can mean virgin, but it can also be just a young woman of marriageable age, a maiden. And that's the way the RSV translates it. When it's applied, however, into Matthew in the Greek, there seems to be a leaning maybe toward what the Septuagint had to say. Because in that passage, Isaiah 7:14, in the Septuagint translation, it uses the word parthenos for virgin. And grasp this, that's the only possible meaning of the word parthenos. Virgin was what was intended. So that tells me by 250 BC that this was understood to be a messianic prophecy by the usage of the word. There was another Greek word they could have used if they wanted to leave it vague, but parthenos is pointed, it's sharp, and it's specific as to the meaning. Now, there's a lot of history that we could go through as it relates to this. There's a lot of different claims as to what is meant. But again, when we get over to Matthew and we look at his account, talking about Christ, let's go ahead. My time is about up, but let's look at this and let's close this out. so that we can clearly understand what's being said here. Looking at Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23. Behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Clearly, that was talking about Mary being that virgin. The word virgin was used, and Matthew, by inspiration, quoted Isaiah 7:14 to apply to her and to apply to Christ. Christ is Emmanuel. He is God with us. Thank you again for your patience. I hope that I'm whetting your appetite for deeper study in the prophets. There are so many good lessons. We'll continue there in chapter 8 then next time. Let me warn you, it's going to be a difficult passage again. It's going to be tough. It's going to portray a tough scene, and then we move into chapter 9 and it's positive again. Until next time, God bless you.